Hi everyone. I'm Bubbles from Susan's family. Today, I'll teach you how to make a Jolie blouse. For this electronic tutorial, you can find the electronic chart on the website. Just search for sousod.com to access it. This sweater consists of the hem, the body, the sleeves, and decorations. First, we'll knit the hem and the body in sequence. Then, we'll pick up stitches at the armhole position and knit the sleeves. Finally, we'll make the decorations. Let's start by learning how to knit the hem. We'll use the right-hand long-tail cast-on method. Knit around and round starting from the cast-on. The stitch techniques we'll use include knit stitch, purl stitch, yarn over, S2 kpo stitch, skpo, and K1 TBL stitches. Now, let's show. First, we'll do the long-tail cast-on. Before casting on, you need to leave a tail of a certain length. It's usually about 3 times the length of the piece. Refer to the chart for the exact length. Make a slip knot with the tail. Hold a straight needle in your left hand, or one end of a circular needle, and insert it into the loop. Slightly tighten it. This is the first stitch. Hold both strands of yarn with your right hand. Insert your thumb and index finger between the 2 strands. Note: the strand connected to the ball of yarn should be on your index finger. The reserved long tail should be on your thumb. Straighten the yarn. Insert the needle from the bottom up into the loop on your thumb. Then pick up the yarn from your index finger from back to front. Pass the yarn through the loop on your thumb. Release the yarn from your thumb. Slightly tighten it. This is the second stitch. Now start the third stitch. Straighten the yarn. Insert the needle from the bottom up into the loop on your thumb. Then pick up the yarn from your index finger from back to front. Pass the yarn through the loop on your thumb. Release the yarn from your thumb. Slightly tighten it. The third stitch is now complete. Continue with the fourth stitch. First, insert the needle into the loop on your thumb. Then pick up the yarn from your index finger and pass it through the loop on your thumb. Release the yarn from your thumb. Slightly tighten it. The fourth stitch is now complete. Pay attention. The yarn connected to the ball should always be on your index finger. The reserved yarn should be on your thumb. Don't get them mixed up. Follow this method, and continue casting on. Cast on until you have the required number of stitches. This is the long tail cast on method. After completing the cast on, start the first round. Knit all stitches. Mind that the starting point doesn't twist. Before you start, you can place a marker on the right needle. The stitch to the left of the marker is the first stitch of each round. Knit all stitches. Complete this round. Once done, the first round is complete. Next, start the second round. Purl all stitches in this round. Move the marker. Once done, the second round is complete. Next, start the third round. Refer to the chart and knit 1 stitch. Then, 1 yarn over stitch. Bring the yarn from front to back over the right needle. Then, 1 s-took po. First, slip 2 stitches from left to right without knitting them. Then, knit 1 stitch. Next, slip the 2 unknitted stitches. Over this stitch. This completes 1 s-took po. Then, 1 yarn over stitch. Knit 6 stitches. After completing this, let's take a look. I consider the stitches I just knitted as one group of stitches. Continue following the chart, and complete the corresponding number of groups for this round. Once done, the third round is complete. Now, move on to the fourth round. Knit all stitches in this round. When you encounter a yarn over stitch, knit it normally. Continue knitting to complete this round. This completes the fourth round. Next, we'll knit the fifth round. Start by knitting 2 stitches. After that, 1 yarn over stitch. Then, 1 s-po. Slip the next stitch from the left needle, knit twice. Then, knit 1 stitch. Pick up the unworked stitch using the left needle. Cover the stitch on the left and slip it. This completes the s-po. Continue knitting to finish this row. This completes the fifth round. For the following rounds, refer to the chart to complete up to the 20th round. The stitch techniques used have all been demonstrated. Continue knitting to complete the remaining rounds. After completing the first 20 rounds, move on to knitting the 21st round. The first stitch is a K1 TBL stitch. Insert the right needle from front to back into the back stand of the first loop. Knit 1 stitch. This completes the K1 TBL stitch. Next, purl 1 stitch. Refer to the chart and knit another K1 TBL stitch and purl stitch. Repeat this twice. After completing these, you will have a yarn over. Leave the yarn tail on the needle. Then, 1s toque po. After completing these, knit a yarn over. Then, purl 1 stitch. Wrap the yarn from top to bottom around the needle. Continue following the chart to complete this round. After finishing, round 21 is completed. Next, everyone continue to follow the chart. Complete the corresponding rounds for the hem. Do not cut the yarn after completing. Now, let's learn how to knit the body. Continue knitting upwards from the hem. The new stitch technique used here is the RLI. Now, let's show everyone. First, follow the chart to complete the first round. Then, knit the second round. Start by knitting the corresponding number of knit stitches. Refer to the chart for the specific stitch count. My sample stitch count is random. Then, knit RLI. Pick up the right side stand of the first chain stitch with the right needle. Knit 1 stitch. This is the added stitch. Continue following the corresponding pattern. Finish this round. After finishing, Then, knit the corresponding number of rounds in stockinette stitch evenly. Don't cut the yarn. This completes the body. Next, we'll learn about the front and back pieces. Both are divided into the chest and shoulder sections. Continue with the previous yarn tail to knit the back piece. You need to bind off stitches on both sides to form the armpits. After binding off the corresponding number of rows, continue working even for the specified number of rows in stockinette stitch. Let me demonstrate the method for binding off stitches under the arm. Learn the method before you start knitting. I'll explain using this small swatch. In the first row, you need to bind off several stitches at the beginning. Refer to the chart for the exact number of stitches. The number of binding off stitch keys indicates how many stitches to bind off. Here, I need to bind off 4 stitches in a row. If you need to bind off a large number of stitches in a row, you can use a stitch marker to separate them. Start binding off the stitches. The first stitch can be a slip stitch or a knit stitch. Here, I'll do a slip stitch. Then, work 1 knit stitch. Next, pass the first stitch over the second stitch. This will bind off 1 stitch. When there are no special instructions, on the right side, always bind off knitwise. Continue with 1 more knit stitch. Bind off 1 stitch. Keep binding off knitwise. Continue until there is only 1 loop left on the right side of the marker. Here, I have 2 loops left, so I need to bind off 1 more stitch. Now there is only 1 loop left on the right side of the marker. This is the 4th stitch's loop. We need to bind off this stitch as well. Therefore, you need to knit 1 more stitch and bind it off. The next stitch is the adjacent stitch of the last bind off stitch key. Here we simply knit it. Note: since different patterns may have different stitch techniques, this stitch needs to be knitted according to the chart. After finishing, bind off the 4th stitch as well. This way, the 4 stitches on the chart are bound off. Continue following the chart for knitting. Note: the next stitch should be started from the 2nd stitch next to the bind off stitch key. Before knitting, slightly tighten this loop to prevent any noticeable holes. There are no special patterns here. We will knit all stitches. Finish this row. Now, we have completed the first row. Continue with the second row. We will work this row on the wrong side. At the beginning, bind off 4 stitches in a row. First, use a stitch marker to separate them. Start binding off. Similarly, you can slip the first stitch. You can also purl. Here, I will slip a stitch. Then purl 1. Next, bring the previous stitch over the next stitch. This binds off 1 stitch. Continue with another purl stitch. Bind off 1 stitch. When there are no special instructions, on the wrong side, you will bind off purlwise. Continue purling and binding off. Keep going until there is only 1 stitch left to the right of the marker. Here, we will bind off 1 more stitch. Now there is only one stitch left to the right of the marker, that is, the loop of the fourth stitch remains. Bind off this stitch as well. So, you need to purl one more stitch and bind it off the next stitch, which is adjacent to the last bind off stitch key. On the wrong side, we will purl this stitch. Bind off the fourth stitch. In actual knitting, the specific stitch technique for this stitch should be followed according to the chart. This way, the 4 stitches on the chart will be bound off. Continue following the chart. Pay attention, the next step is to start knitting from the second stitch, next to the bind off stitch key. Before knitting, slightly tighten this loop. To prevent any noticeable holes. There are no special patterns here, so we will purl all stitches. Now, we have finished the second row. Next, bind off on the right side. Using the same method as in the first row. When binding off on the wrong side, use the same method as in the second row. I'll demonstrate 2 more rows. Continue with the third row. At the beginning of this row, bind off 2 stitches. First, bind off 1 stitch. On the right side, bind off knitwise. Then, knit 1 stitch and bind it off. Note: when binding off the last stitch, the stitch you knit should follow the pattern chart. Sometimes the pattern is special, so it might not be a knit stitch here. Make sure you don't make a mistake. The same applies to the wrong side. Now I've bound off 2 stitches. Continue to finish this row. After completing it, continue with the fourth row. At the beginning of this row, bind off 2 stitches as well. First, bind off 1 stitch. On the wrong side, bind off purlwise. Then purl 1 more stitch and bind off. This way, you've bound off 2 stitches. Continue to finish this row. Now I've completed the fourth row. If you only need to bind off 1 stitch on each side, use the same method as when binding off the first stitch. This is the method for binding off underarm stitches. After finishing the chest piece, move on to knitting the shoulders. Start by knitting the right shoulder. Work the corresponding number of rows and stockinette stitch evenly. After completing, hold on the stitches on the needle. Then, take a new yarn, and hold on the corresponding number of stitches. After holding on, reattach the yarn. Next, knit the left shoulder. After finishing the left shoulder, hold on the stitches as well. I'll now demonstrate the method for binding off, and the method for reattaching the yarn and continuing to knit. Learn the methods before you start knitting. Now I'll demonstrate the method for holding on stitches. After finishing one side, transfer the loops to a separate needle or circular needle. You can also thread them together. When you resume knitting, transfer them back to the needle. Thread from right to left. This completes the holding on stitches. Reattach the yarn. Make a slip knot. Slightly tighten the loop. Then refer to the chart to continue knitting. This is the method for reattaching the yarn and continuing to knit. After completing the back piece, move on to the front piece. Here, you need to reattach the yarn. You also need to bind off at both sides to form the armpits. After completing the chest piece, move on to the shoulders. The method for knitting the shoulders is almost the same as for the back piece. However, when binding off at the end, you need to match and bind off with the corresponding shoulder of the front piece. I'll demonstrate the method for reattaching the yarn and binding off, as well as merging and binding off. First, learn the method. Then refer to the chart to continue knitting. Pick up the new yarn. Make a slip knot. Slightly tighten the loop. Knit 2 stitches. Then bind off 1 stitch. Knit 1 more stitch. Bind off 1 stitch. When there are no special instructions, on the right side, you will bind off knitwise. Continue to bind off the remaining stitches. The first method is stitch-to-stitch joining. This situation occurs when all the stitches are in loops. It is a commonly used joining method. You join the pieces by merging and binding off. This is typically used to join the shoulders of the front and back pieces. Both pieces are in loop form. We will use the stockinette stitch side as the right side. Merging and binding off is usually done on the wrong side of the piece. This means you need to place the 2 pieces with their right sides facing each other. Typically, one of the pieces is not cut. Whichever piece the working yarn is on, place that side on the right. When merging and binding off, you will bind off knitwise. This means passing through the loops of both pieces simultaneously. Bind off knitwise. The stitch count of the two pieces is usually identical, just work into each stitch and bind off. If one of the pieces has more stitches, you need to decrease while binding off on the side with more stitches. For example, if this piece has more stitches, you can insert your hook into 2 loops at once. Then continue by inserting into 1 loop of the back piece, and bind off knitwise. If the other piece has more stitches, insert your hook into 2 loops at once on that side, and bind off knitwise. Here, the two pieces have the same number of stitches. Continue to bind them off. Tie off the yarn tail and hide it. This is the result after binding off and joining the pieces. Up to this point, we've covered the front and back pieces. Next, let's learn how to knit the sleeves. There are 2 identical sleeves. The method is the same for both. You start by picking up the corresponding number of stitches at the armholes. Then, work in rounds. Let me demonstrate the method for picking up stitches at the armholes. First, pick up stitches along the armhole. I'll use a small sample to demonstrate. Take 1 straight needle. You can see that there are spaces between the 2 stitches on the edge of the fabric piece. Each row corresponds to 1 space. Start picking up the spaces from the side of the underarm seam. Refer to the chart for the specific pattern for picking up stitches. Pick up the corresponding number of stitches evenly. Pay attention to starting as close to the seam as possible. This prevents large gaps from forming under the arm. After picking up about 1/3 of the stitches, Take a second straight needle to continue picking up stitches. Be mindful to tighten the yarn at the junction. Once completed, place a stitch marker below the third straight needle. Finish the loops on this needle. This indicates the completion of the entire round. The first and last stitches will be on either side of the underarm seam. That completes the picking up of stitches. Continue with the first round. Take the fourth needle and work the corresponding stitches in rounds. The stitch pattern in the sample is random. Please refer to the chart for specifics. At the junction of the two needles, try to tighten the first stitch as much as possible. This prevents large gaps in the fabric. Complete the loops on the needle marked by the stitch marker. The first round of the sleeve body is complete. Pick up the corresponding number of stitches, then follow the chart to knit. After completing all the stitches, bind off the stitches. In the following knitting process, you will use new stitch techniques, including K2 tog, K3 tog, SK2 tog, O, and LLI. I'll demonstrate each of these stitch techniques. Everyone, start by learning the method, then follow the chart to knit. First, learn the K2 tog stitch, which is also known as the K2 tog stitch. When knitting, insert the right needle from left to right, and pass through both of these loops. Then knit one stitch. This completes the K2 tog stitch. You can see that the left loop will be above the right loop. On the right side, work a K3 tog. Insert the hook from left to right and pass through all three left loops. Then knit one stitch. After you finish, you can see that the left loop is at the top. For the SK2 tog, O, first pick up one stitch from left to right. Then work a knit stitch through the next two left loops. Then, pull the picked up loop over the left loop. The SK2 tog, O, is now complete. You can see that the right loop is at the top. For the LLI stitch, usually, below the loop is a braid. First, pick up this loop and work a knit stitch. Then, find the second braid below the loop. Insert the left needle from left to right and pick up the left strand of this braid. And then work a knit stitch. This single stitch on the left is the added stitch. That's how you complete a LLI stitch. Now we've covered the sleeves. Next, let's learn how to knit the collar. First, thread the held loops from the back piece onto the knitting needle. Work the corresponding stitch pattern. Then, on the shoulder edges, pick up 1-2 strands of yarn. Pick up the corresponding number of stitches evenly. Then, thread the held loops from the front piece onto the knitting needle. Work the corresponding stitch pattern as well. After completing this, on the other side of the shoulder edge, pick up the corresponding number of stitches evenly. Once the picking up is done, follow the chart to continue knitting. Finally, bind off stitches. That's how you complete the collar. Lastly, let's sew on the decorations. These include the pleats on the front piece, and the decorations on the neckline. Let's start with making the pleats. The pleats are roughly located at the chest area. Before you start, measure the length of the curve, from the bottom of your chest to where you want the collar edge to be. Then, sew the pleats between these points. Now, I'll demonstrate the method for making the pleats. First, cut a piece of yarn, about 40 centimeters long. Thread it through the sewing needle, and fold it in half. Once you've determined the pleat positions, fold the fabric to create the pleats at the corresponding points. Then, insert the needle from the inside and pull it through. Pass the needle through each pleat. Pass it through again to secure. Finally, thread the yarn tail to the inside of the garment. Then tie a knot to secure it. You can tie a few more knots to ensure it's fixed. Finally, leave a little bit and cut the yarn tail. That's the method for making the pleats. Next, we'll work on the collar decoration. Start by crocheting a shrimp stitch. The length should be approximately between the held stitch positions of neckline, on the front piece. Pay attention, it is the flat measurement. You can also determine the exact length based on your preference. Now, I'll demonstrate the crochet technique for the shrimp stitch. Note that you should leave about 10 centimeters of yarn tail at both ends before and after crocheting. Now, I'll demonstrate the crochet technique for the shrimp stitch. Start with a foundation chain. Crochet 2 chain stitches. Then insert the hook into the top loop of the first chain stitch. Yarn over. Draw the yarn through. Yarn over again. Draw the yarn through both loops. Keep the hook in place. Turn the fabric piece clockwise. Then, pick up these 2 strands with the hook. Yarn over. Draw through. Yarn over again, pull through the loops on the hook. Continue turning the fabric piece clockwise. Pick up these 2 strands with the hook. Yarn over. Work a single crochet. Continue turning the fabric piece clockwise. Pick up the same 2 strands as before, and work a single crochet. Repeat this method throughout. Turn the fabric piece clockwise. Then pick up the 2 vertical strands on the left top, and work a single crochet. Crochet to the desired length. Then secure with 1 chain stitch. Leave a tail, break the yarn. If you need to sew it, leave a longer tail. This is the crocheting technique of the shrimp stitch. After completing the shrimp stitch, sew it to the corresponding position. First, thread the reserved yarn tail into a darning needle. Then sew, and secure it at the corresponding position on the left side. You can sew a few more stitches for extra security. After sewing, weave in the ends inside the shrimp stitch. Trim any excess tails. Then thread the yarn tail from the other end into a darning needle. When sewing this end, add pearls. Make sure the shrimp stitch doesn't twist. After sewing, weave in the ends inside the shrimp stitch. That covers all the decorations. Up to this point, that concludes the entire tutorial for this sweater. If you have any questions during the process, Don't hesitate to reach us via our website, Susan's Family, supporting your handwork experience, sharing the joy of life. Thank you for watching. See you in the next episode.